Hey, before we get started, just a heads up that we've got some awesome stuff on BJJ Mental Models Premium you probably want to know about. We've got some collaborative work with Andrew Wiltsey, with Margot Ciccarelli, and with John Thomas. At the moment, we're getting close to about 50 hours of premium stuff on there, and the library is always growing. Highly recommend you check it out if you haven't already. There's a free trial, so there's no risk. If you try it and you don't like it, I'll happily refund it because I'm pretty sure that you will like it. Hundreds of other people already do. Please do check it out if you haven't already. Premium.bjjmentalmodels.com. One more time, that's premium.bjjmentalmodels.com. Thanks again for supporting us and enjoy the show. Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 178. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. Rolling again with fan favorite, Mr. Robert Degle. Robert, how are you doing, buddy?
Good. Thanks for having me on again.
I'm happy to have you on here, man. Now, something that we wanted to talk about, general broad stroke discussion. I wanted to pick your brain following up on some stuff that actually you posted on Instagram. You've been talking a lot recently about stuff you wish you'd learned earlier in your jiu-jitsu journey, and you're always talking about learning methodologies, how to just better optimize your time. And I know on the past in the podcast, you've come on here and talked about this before. But with that said, I'd love to just give you the floor and talk about the stuff in a bit more detail than you can do in an Insta post. So with that said, I mean, I don't think introductions are necessary because I know you've been on the pod many times before. So why don't we just get into it, man? Open floor. Tell me what you want to talk about.
Yeah. So I was interested in talking about specifically learning jujitsu and how we can frame that and how we can optimize it to the best of our ability. Because I think that, so there's two interesting sort of intersecting problems here. The first is just how do you optimize jujitsu learning? But then the second problem, and I think this is very interrelated with that, is in what direction should you optimize your jujitsu learning? And I think that the first question has a very specific, narrow answer. Whereas I think the second one is going to be very much down to your personal preference. And I don't think that's often how it's framed. So okay, so let's talk about what happens when you're a white belt and you first start learning jiu-jitsu. You come into the school, you don't really know pretty much about jiu-jitsu other than what you've seen maybe through YouTube or Instagram or whatever. And you come into the school and your basic assumption is probably that there's a direct, I shouldn't say this for everybody, but I think for a lot of people, especially those that get very into jiu-jitsu, your initial assumption is going to be that competition results are going to correlate directly with who is or what is the best jiu-jitsu. I mean, I know, for instance, that's exactly what I thought. I assumed there would be a one-to-one correlation between what, air quote, what works and what results come about in competition, right? And that phrase, what works, it's oftentimes said in combination with what is high percentage. I think that these phrases they're essentially at this point meaningless buzzwords in the minds of most jiu-jitsu people. They don't actually think about what does it mean to say what works, right? Because what works, that begs the question, what works for what? To what end? You know what I mean? And then the thing is people sort of the natural intuitive answer to that question is what works in competition? Well, but that sort of runs up against how a lot of people talk about competition, right? In the sense that how often do you hear people say stuff like, oh, he just stalled. Somebody just stalled. But then they won the match. Here's a common example. AJ Agazarm versus Ethan Crelinsten, ADCC 2017. A lot of people said AJ stalled in that match, right? I'm not here to say whether he did or not, right? I'm just saying that people said that, right? But AJ completely, fairly, within the rules, won the match. He 100%. There's really no argument about that. So a lot of people watch this match and they feel sort of a temptation to go well, one guy won the match, but the other guy expressed better jiu-jitsu. Well, but I thought that we were defining what works, i.e. better jiu-jitsu, as being what got results in competition. So we see there's a conflict here. These are not the same things, right? So And I think that the sooner you understand this in your jiu-jitsu journey, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, did you want to jump in?
No. I was just thinking about what you're saying here. And I think that another little layer to add, people often talk about what works at the highest levels and what's high percentage, and they base that based on what happens, at the elite world class level. But it's important to understand that the answer to that, even if you want to go with that definition of, okay, what actually works, it's not as simple as one thing works and another thing doesn't. There is not one jiu-jitsu world champion, right? We assign new champions every year in multiple different classes and divisions. So there's a ton of world champions, and it's very, very likely that you can see two world champions do completely contradictory things, both of which work at high levels. So even if you're obsessively studying what works at the highest level, you can still get yourself into a bit of a bind, because what worked for one person at the highest level might be completely different from what worked for another person. And that doesn't even get into things like the individual context and the style matchup between one person and the other in the rule set. So it's a lot more complicated than just looking at your favorite world champ and trying to literally carbon copy everything that they did into your own game. There's a lot more nuance than that.
Yeah. I mean, so that connects into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is that okay, so I think that when we think about what works, I think a better way to think of things, instead of just saying what works, period, point blank, is thinking about what works to what end. And so in that sense, you can start thinking about you can think about specific techniques as solving specific mechanical or tactical problems. And then you want to ask yourself, broadly speaking, I think as early on as possible, you want to think about, so you've got the individual techniques, but then you have strategy, and those techniques are going to fit into the strategy. And the strategy is going to be heavily dependent upon the specific rule set you want to succeed in. So I think early on, it's really good to establish okay, what are your goals? And it's totally okay if you don't know what your goals are per se. When I say early on, I don't mean the first week or something, but definitely I think let's say within 1 month of training, you decided, okay, my main interest is in doing really well at IBJJF gi tournaments, right? Just as an example. Or you could have also said something oh, my main interest is in getting really good at EBI rules sub only. Okay. That's going to give you a sense of direction and almost a lens through which you can filter what you should be working on. Because now you have, you could look at a technique and ask yourself, this is a good example. There's an EBI back control escape, which is really popular, which in other rule sets, it's not really that good of an escape. It involves rotating towards this. If somebody has a body triangle, you can rotate towards the side of the knee that is not, it's the knee of the leg that is on the bottom of the triangle. If you get what I'm saying, right? So the guy's got the triangle locked, the side of the knee of the leg that is.
You rotate onto that side. Yeah.
It's hard to explain verbally, but yeah, you get what I'm saying. You rotate in that direction. So what the escape does is most of the time it puts you in mount. If you're really good, maybe you can spin into the guy's guard, but at a high level, that's really rare. But in EBI, that's an escape. That's a perfectly fine escape. Going from back control to the mount, if you do that in, 8 seconds, great. You got the fuck out. That's really good. Whereas in ADCC, it's not really that good at all. You're still on bottom. You're getting fucked up. So it's that back escape, so the question is, does that back escape work? Well, what that back escape does on a mechanical level, it does a really good job of putting you into a mount once you're in a back control. The extent to which that matters strategically depends upon the context of the rule set. So when people ask themselves things they go, they will say stuff I only want to do stuff that works at the elite level. I think that you need to think a little bit deeper about what you're saying, because okay, let's talk about just no gi for a second, right? Let's talk about ADCC. If I take you at your word and you say, I only want to do things that work at the most elite level, and we are defining that as being ADCC, and the most elite level of ADCC is the super fight and the absolute tournament, I would tell you, you should go to your local bodybuilding gym, find the most jacked guy there, ask him to buy Tren, and get a wrestling coach. Those are the main things I think you should work on, right? But the thing is I think most people, they would feel like, they're like, that's not really why I got into this. And it's like, well, yeah. So it's something different than just winning ADCC, right? So it's like, so I think that when you ask, does something work? Don't just think about, is it going to yield the desired competitive result? Ask what is this going to accomplish mechanically? And then what does accomplishing that goal mechanically, how does that benefit me tactically and strategically in different rule sets? And to what extent should I care, right? Maybe I've seen matches where, I'll give you an example. Eddie Cummings versus Augusto Tanquinho Mendes. Tanquinho won because Eddie pulled guard in overtime, but there are other rule sets where Eddie would have won that match. So for instance, Naga rules. I mean, we can laugh, obviously, but it is true. He would have won the match under Naga rules. Or even Kasai rules. Kasai rules, Eddie would have won that match. So then you ask yourself, okay, is it the result that I care about here? To some extent, of course it is. Nobody wants to lose. Or is it the grappling that I'm trying to express that I care more about? Obviously, look, it's not like an either or thing. We care to some extent about both. But I think that early on in your career, if you think about what are my priorities, it will allow you to avoid this pitfall of just thinking about competition results as being the only thing that matters. Do you get what I'm saying?
100%. We actually, my brother and I did a 7-part, I want to say, series on exactly this kind of thing on our premium service. And one of the first things we talked about is, look, if you want to build a game plan or have a strategy, the first thing you have to do is be real with yourself about what are my goals and what are the reasons for why I'm actually doing this in the first place. Using myself as an example, I don't compete. I'm a total hobbyist, right? I invest 100 times more time and attention and effort into this fucking podcast than I do in actually doing jiu-jitsu, just because that's where my priority is at the moment. And for me to pattern my game exactly off of someone who has gone and won a world championship wouldn't make sense, because I will never go and compete at that level. It just isn't a goal to me. It's not only a matter of whether I can or can't do it. It's just that's not what my life focuses. For me, jiu-jitsu has always been a hobby, and I invest a certain amount of time into that hobby because I love it. But I'm not going to quit everything else that I do and go do jiu-jitsu professionally. That just has never been what I wanted out of the sport. So for me to go and pattern my game after what works for the best in the world doesn't make sense, because I'm not the best in the world. Am I going to be able to go in there and hang with Gordon Ryan or Andre Galvao? No, absolutely not. And that's simply not going to be the case no matter what I do, right? My strategy is much more in line with the kind of OG marketing for jiu-jitsu, which is look, I am this regular schmuck who's not particularly athletic, and I don't have all the time in the world, but I just want to get in relatively decent shape, have fun, and learn how to defend myself if the situation ever arises. The kind of jiu-jitsu that I do is totally perfect for that particular skill set. But if you were to take my game and have someone at an elite level do the stuff I do, it's totally going to fail, because they're in there with a much higher caliber of athlete in the same weight class. But if your goals are different, right? If you're just in here because you want to have fun, you want to be able to protect yourself against someone who's 100 pounds bigger than you, you're not particularly athletic, then a different strategy maybe applies. So I think that being totally honest and open about your goals is important, because, and it goes both ways, right? If you, like me, are a hobbyist, it does not necessarily make sense to carbon copy what world champions do and just assume it'll work for you. And the opposite applies. If your goal is to be a world champion, perhaps doing what your local instructor says at a regional or local level doesn't make sense either, because they're targeting a different group than you. So having that kind of sit down with yourself where you really introspect what your goals are is a very important first step to building any kind of strategy, because otherwise you're likely going to build the wrong strategy, because strategy is not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, like so here's an example of pretty much what you were just talking about. It's like, okay, so if you go and you say to yourself, okay, I just want to do what the absolute best in the world are doing, and you are mainly a no-gi guy, and then you go, okay, so the best in the world are doing ADCC, I should do what they're doing. And let's say you're in your you might not even want to compete per se. You want to think to yourself, okay, I'm optimizing my time. I'm only doing what the best in the world are doing. That's going to mean a lot of wrestling. And there's nothing wrong with that. Wrestling is like a really fun thing to work on. But imagine you're like a 35-year-old guy and you have like, I don't know, like a herniated disc in your back. and your local coach is like, listen, man, if you're not doing what the elite guys are doing, you're fucking wasting your time. And that guy is like, yeah, I mean, like, and that guy is like more interested in like retaining his guard and attacking maybe like from submissions for bottom or maybe getting sweeps or something. Like he doesn't want to play like a mega aggressive wrestling style game. It's like, that is like, I do agree under the ADCC rule set, playing a wrestling style game is probably the optimal meta. It's probably like I think it's a key component of optimizing your strategy within that rule set. But does that mean that it's the best way for like, you know, let's say, I'll even say like a competitor. Like imagine if Paulo Miao tried to do what Pablo Popovich used to do. I don't think that's going very well for him. You know, like it's not going to work super well. So you got to tailor your approach. This is sort of veering off into like other areas like your body type and stuff like that.
It all matters though, right? Your body type dictates your strategy. And we don't talk about that enough in jiu-jitsu.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. But it's like, even just from the perspective of like, so when you think about your goals, like, so I've only been using competition examples so far, but really we don't have to just use it. Your goal could be, you could be like a 42-year-old guy. You're just doing this for fun. And you're like, well, my goal is I get satisfaction out of solving problems and thinking about how to accomplish new technical tasks every day in training, right? There's something inherently satisfying about that, right? And you just come to training and that's what you love to do. And it's like, so I think that there's nothing wrong with focusing first and foremost on that instead of just thinking about like what is going to work at the air quote highest level. Because right when I say highest level, right now I'm talking about, let's say ADCC. There are so many things that are really fun to learn. Like here's a great example. I think rubber guard is a really interesting set of techniques. There's a really interesting system around the rubber guard. And people ask me all the time, does rubber guard work? Well, okay, I want to kind of like look at what does that mean a little bit. Can you pull off rubber guard techniques against a person who's very good? I think you definitely can. But I think the reason why it's hard to do that in something like the ADCC rule set is mainly because I think that the rubber guard is something that takes a long time to get working. So if you're playing rubber guard and someone's like a really jacked wrestler dude, even if you're a really good rubber guard player, if they just don't want to, you have them in rubber guard and they just want to keep squaring up with you and basically just stalling, and like, I don't blame them, they're defending, but they're not like progressing in any way. Like it can be pretty easy to do that from a defensive perspective, right? But the thing is if you have infinite time to work, that's not going to work because you're not getting out of the situation. I think if you have a really good rubber guard player, like let's say it's ADCC rules, right? Let's say it's trials. You have a really good rubber guard player. First minute of the match, the rubber guard player gets rubber guard. All the guy has to do is survive 5 minutes. And then guess what? You're getting stood up. And if you pull guard, you get hit with a negative. He could even do that. He pulls guard. He gets hit with a negative. He does another 3 minutes of rubber guard and the guy just stalls against it. That's not that hard to do. But you'll notice at no point did the other guy get himself out of the situation, right? He was in the situation the whole time, but he won the match because of the rule set, for better or worse. I don't want to like pass judgment on specific rule sets. This is just the reality of it, right? Now, like you could take that same situation, sub only, no time limit. 45 minutes in, the rubber guard guy gets let's say a dead orchard, right? Did that work? Yeah, it did. So I think rubber guard definitely can work. It just, I think it usually takes a while to work. But I've been inside the rubber guard of some fucking really good rubber guard players. And the only thing I felt like I could do was just like stall and not get tapped. Yeah. And it's like, it's not that hard to do that, but that wears on you over time. And over time, you know, good jujitsu, like really technical jujitsu is oftentimes very patient. And this is something I think that sometimes people miss in tournaments with limited time constraints. There are understandable reasons why tournaments have time constraints, right? I think it would be pretty bad if we got rid of that. But like, it sometimes can rush things and you sort of like miss stuff because of that. But anyway, so this is one part of what I wanted to talk about, which is first and foremost, I think it's a good idea to analyze what does it mean to say that something works. But let's talk a little bit now about like what it means to say something is high percentage, because like, I think you and I have talked about this on the podcast before. I don't remember, but that one I can like kind of run through pretty quickly because I have a pretty clear definition of what I mean when I say like high percentage. Okay. I think what most people think of when they say high percentage is they go, oh, I saw this move work 10 times. That's a lot. Or even let's say 100 times. I've seen this move work 100 times. That's a lot. This is a high percentage move. That's not what that means. Like what's referring to something as high percentage means that the amount of times you've seen it attempted versus the amount of times it succeeded is like, there's not much of a difference there. So for instance, like if I've seen a move attempted 1,000 times, but it succeeded 100 times, that is not high percentage, right? Like that is low percentage, right? Just like by definition, it's low percentage. Whereas like we could take two moves, they both succeed 100 times. That doesn't tell us which is high percentage, right? Rather, what it tells us is that the move can work, right? Like to find if something is high percentage, you want to evaluate the contrast between the number of times it's attempted and the number of times it succeeds. And you want that number to be as close as possible, right? That's what tells you something is high percentage. And then you also want to see that contextually within the given like situation, the given rule set, the body types of the athletes involved. Some of this, there's like literally guesswork involved, right? You might think like, sometimes there are times where people do things and you're not even sure like why they did that. And you kind of have to do some guesswork. Well, maybe he did this because of the specific rule set on a tactical level. He was trying to do this. Like, so I'll give you an example of that. If you don't understand how points are scored in ADCC or IBJJF when it comes to a guard pass, you're going to look at competition and think all these guys turtling up are idiots. Why are they giving their backs? Well, they're doing it because there's a tactical reason. They're trying to deny their opponent points. But like I've seen like white and blue belt hobbyists comment, like there was a match, Justin Rader and Cobrinha. Cobrinha went to pass Justin Rader's guard. Rader turtled up. Cobrinha got his back and he choked him out. These are two elite level competitors. And it's like fucking dumbass blue belt. It's like, what a moron. He exposed his back. It's like, no, you're a fucking idiot. You don't understand why he did that. Like there was a specific reason. Like, of course it ultimately didn't work out for him, but I'm like, it's fucking Cobrinha. Like, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. Like, so it's like, yeah, it didn't work out, but it's like there was an intelligent tactical motivation for that action in the situation. And it, you know, you're going to have to sort of put that into your assessment of, you know, the viability, the high percentage-ness, whatever, of the technique, of the given movement in the situation, right? Yeah. And so that's what it means to say something is high percentage. And like, typically when I think about like when a move will succeed versus when it won't, I try to evaluate like what defenses does the move have to overcome? And that's going to be a reflection of the number of times it succeeds versus the number of times it's attempted. So for instance, like if a move only has to overcome really like a very low quantity of low quality defenses, you're going to see it succeed more often. And then that's going to be reflected in the rate of success versus rate of attempts. Whereas obviously if there's a higher quantity of higher quality defenses, then like you're not going to see it work out as much, right? So these two sides, it's kind of like two sides of the same coin. That's going to determine whether something is high percentage. And just sort of to recap this part of the discussion, it's not just about thinking about high percentage in terms of like a single framework. It's in terms of your wider goals, which may or may not be competition focused, which may or may not be any individual given competition. It could be EBI rules. It could be IBJJF rules. It could be ADCC rules. It could be sub only, no time limit. You could have the goal of wanting to be a really dangerous submission artist in any rule set and not really care personally about whether you're winning matches per se, right? You want to get the submissions, but like maybe winning is your secondary consideration, right? And I think that's perfectly valid. It just depends on what you're after, right? So I think you got to think about like ultimately, what are you trying to get out of this sport? And then what's the best way to go about getting it? So then I guess that brings it to the other point, which, did you want to add anything in before I jumped into that?
No, I agree with what you said here, particularly around this misunderstanding about what high percentage means. I've seen a lot of people attempt to collate data in the jiu-jitsu space, and usually it invariably proves that things like arm bars and rear naked chokes are the highest percentage moves. But people are kind of, I think a lot of the times, misconstruing high volume versus high percentage, because you're right. Everyone in jiu-jitsu is trained certain techniques from day one that we call the fundamentals. And yes, when you go to competitions, if you are just counting up, say, the number of successful submissions and trying to categorize them into, okay, which submission racks up the most wins, yeah, you're going to see things like arm bars and things like rear naked chokes be really high up on the list. And honestly, there's something to it, right? I mean, I think that these are moves that just generally are more likely to work than some of the more exotic things. But like you said, the reason why you're seeing so many successful arm bars is because every jiu-jitero out there is taught from day one that these are the fundamentals. And so we significantly overweight those techniques. People, they are trained in those techniques, so they're more likely to try them. And so you're more likely to see attempts. And that also means, you're probably more likely to see successful arm bars too. But the real interesting number is not how many successful arm bars were there in terms of absolute number. It's how many successful arm bars were there relative to attempts. And I think that looking at that would make you maybe rethink what high percentage means. I mean, if an arm bar were truly high percentage, you would expect to see that 80% of arm bar attempts result in a tap. And that probably doesn't happen. I would love to see that data. And this also raises interesting questions of, there are tons of submissions in the judo canon, and there were a handful that were kind of decided upon as being the jiu-jitsu fundamentals. And it makes you wonder, like, what would jiu-jitsu look like if some of those other things that we consider more exotic were focused on? What if, the original Gracie grandpas had decided that the Ezekiel choke, which is a classic judo choke, what if that was the thing that they felt was really fundamental, and that became something that was taught from day one to every white belt in the world? Would we see that the Ezekiel choke is actually viewed now as the most successful technique just because it gets taught more frequently? So it's an interesting discussion about how, what we're taught dictates and steers which submissions and techniques we gravitate towards, and whether the fact that we train these things more frequently is ultimately what makes them more high percentage versus any innate greatness about particular moves, right? How much of that is just due to the training and the fact that we focus on these techniques to the exclusion of others?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. Like, so what I was getting at was mainly about like that there are certain, I think it's actually a very similar point, is that so you have certain assumptions about connecting the results of competition with like a correlation between the results of competition and, air quote, what works per se, right? And then I don't really think there's a one-to-one correlation there. I do think there's some degree of connectedness there, of course, but we have to situate that in terms of I think what competition mainly does is it displays to us mechanical effectiveness within time constraints and given certain tactical considerations. And then that's like any given technique, in the move in and of itself, the effectiveness of the move in and of itself is one thing. But then when you put it within that framework of a time constraint with certain tactical considerations, it's a completely separate question about does it work, right? And that's kind of what I was getting at. But then there's also this point that you're getting at, which I think is very valid, which is that we also come into jiu-jitsu. There are cultural and social sort of assumptions about what you ought to be taught at each level, right? So you have what is fundamental? What are the fundamentals? Because this is like a topic I actually want to talk about this like extensively in the future, where I just think that we have I don't really agree oftentimes with what people frame as being the fundamentals. Like I don't think that you need to learn, for instance, like Americanas from Mount.
I would agree strongly.
Maybe one time ever, like there's no harm in knowing that the move exists. And I actually think you can use the move to connect to other things. But like, there are certain things like, or like, for instance, like, I think just a random example, I think that like, I don't think that teaching white belts like actively bad arm bars from close guard is like fundamental. You know what I mean? Like that, like you could just teach them how to do it like correctly rather than like nobody does this. Like you ever see that drill where the guys just swing their legs side to side?
I knew you were going to bring up that exact drill. I have probably done that drill thousands of times in my life, but I don't think I've ever actually hit an arm bar doing that in a roll.
Yeah. Or like the shrimping drill down the mat. Like, what is that benefiting? Maybe it's like a slight core workout. Like it's just it's a complete fucking waste of time and energy. It's so stupid.
Well, I think it also actively misinforms people about how they should be using these techniques, because when you go into a drill, right, when you start a class at a Gracie Baja or wherever, and they're doing that, the warm up and they make you shrimp down the mat, you're going to come away with that as a white belt under the impression that, look, if you want to shrimp or if you want to bridge, it needs to be this big explosive movement. And that's not always the case. If you try to do that against a good person, if you try to do a big power shrimp or a power bridge, man, you can wind up in a really bad spot because you're actually creating a lot of openings, you're exposing parts of your body, making it easier for them to climb the mount. And of course, you're just wasting a lot of energy. The way that I do these very basic quote unquote fundamentals now is totally different from the way that they're drilled. And so a lot of that stuff, the kind of classic jiu-jitsu warm up where you do things like shrimp down the mat and you do a bunch of bridges, I kind of worry that we're actually teaching people bad form, because that kind of stuff is more of a kata. Like it doesn't really translate very well to how you would bridge or shrimp if some dude is sitting on top of you in side control and he's really good and he's moving and responding to what you're doing, right? You would change the technique in that situation. So I actually think those drills can be harmful.
Right. So this is actually a perfect segue to the second thing that I wanted to talk about, which is, okay, so you've got your goals. You sort of thought about what you want to do. You understand that when you evaluate things in terms of what works and what's high percentage, it's more nuanced than just assuming there's a one-to-one correlation between competition success and results. Now comes time to figure out what should I work on to get what I want, right? And that I think ultimately is going to come down to observation and not discarding what people have to say, but not just blindly listening to what people have to say. So, okay, let's just like run through an example of this. Let's say you decide early on that you want to win ADCC as an example, right? This is pretty common nowadays. A lot of people want to win ADCC. Okay, so you say that's your goal. Okay, what you're going to want to do is try to look at the people that are, this is almost like, it's going to sound like the opposite of what I just said, but hopefully I'll explain like why I don't think it is. You want to do exactly what I was just saying you don't have to do, which is that if you want to win ADCC, if that really is your main goal, I would say don't listen to what people have to say about it. You might listen, and if there's someone who you respect and you think you're intelligent, you take their opinion into consideration. But ultimately, you want to just see for yourself, like what is and is not getting the job done at this specific task. So I think this is actually a better way to frame frame things. Like it shouldn't be about like what works. You want to think about like what gets what job done. That's like, I think, a better way to think of it. But anyway, so you say to yourself, okay, ADCC is my goal. I would go find all the guys that consistently win in that format, the people who do well in that format, and sort of reverse engineer, why is what they're doing working? What skill sets do they have that's leading to this success? What sort of and it's not even just jujitsu skill sets. It might be sports psychology, might be nutrition, could be like weight cutting strategies, could be, like strength and conditioning programs, whatever, right? Like could be coordination, balance, et cetera, right? Figure out, reverse engineer, what are these guys doing that's leading them to have this success? And then develop a map for yourself, okay, I'm going to work on getting these skills over this length of time. And that's going to lead to me being able to have the skills and the capabilities to accomplish this specific goal that I've set for myself. And you should always be willing to amend your plan. Like you may come to maybe you conclude that one thing is really valuable. And then down the line, you go, you know what? I'm not so sure anymore. This is as valuable as I thought it was. You got to be able to like amend that plan. But if you do this well at the beginning, you shouldn't have to amend it that much where like, you're seeing, generally speaking, what does and does not work. And the mistake people make here is they go way too much off of just hearsay and what someone can be very intelligent, but also say very dumb things, like for real,
yes.
Yeah. Like there are people who are really, really intelligent who are, prone to saying and sometimes thinking very stupid things. And if you just take what they've said at like face value and you just go with that, it might be leading you in the wrong direction, right? Instead, like if let's say, let me contrast two situations. Let's say your goal is to go from one side of the town to the other. And I give you verbally a set of directions, or maybe I'm on the phone with you, right? Maybe so you don't have to remember it or anything. So I'm on the phone with you and I give you directions, right? Whether you get to your destination or not is going to come down to whether I've figured things out. By contrast, if you, and obviously this is going to take way longer, but if you map out the town, you sort of explore, you plan your route out, now you don't have to just listen to what I say. Because the thing is the first approach might be faster. Definitely. And there's definitely utility in listening to what people have to say. But if that's all you do, you're reliant on other people and here's the key part, they can lead you astray, right? And there's so much of that in jiu-jitsu because not only are instructors trying to improve your jiu-jitsu, they're trying to keep you to continue to buy their instructions, right? So oftentimes if you look at this, sort of the things that instructors say, they won't admit when other people have figured stuff out that's good. They'll downplay it. But then in their own way, they'll rephrase it or something, right? It's okay, so this works, you just don't want to admit it, right? So would caution you guys, don't just look at what people are saying. Look at what they're doing. And then over time, and you yourself want to look at, everyone learns jiu-jitsu through observation. The only difference between you as a white belt and a very, very knowledgeable black belt is that the black belt has spent more time engaging in observational learning. Or, it's not just about the amount of time. He may have also engaged in learning more deliberately. Maybe he's his strategy for acquiring knowledge is more refined and such. But ultimately, obviously, there is still an increase in the amount of things he's observed, right? There is some sense in which the greater amount of things you've observed, the more you're going to know, right? So yeah, ultimately your goal should be not just to listen to what other people have to say, but to map out the route yourself so that you're not listening. It shouldn't be about, I really have faith in this other person. It should be about, what I've seen, and I have collected data intelligently, not just anecdotally, but what I've seen through, rational observation and data collection leads me to these conclusions. And I'm going to form this hypothesis, if you will, this working strategy to develop these skills to accomplish these goals, right? And like I said, there's always refinement going on there.
Yeah. It's also worth pointing out, too, that when you're trying to take lessons from other people, there's different types of advice and different ways that people can give you info. If you're, for example, attending a seminar or you buy an instructional and you see what some elite level grappler does, that person has no idea who you are. They have no idea what your game is or what your goals are. So when they give advice with broad strokes like that, and when you buy an instructional and they say, do all of these things, they're not telling you what to do based on your game or their knowledge of you. They're basically just saying, here's what worked for me. And that's an important thing to understand, is that Just because something worked for one person, it might not work for someone else. And that's an important bit of context, because the person giving you the advice doesn't have any reason to believe or to understand why that would be good advice for you. They're more saying, here are the things that worked for me. You've paid me to give this seminar, or you've paid me because I made this instructional. So this is me as the instructor without any context telling you what's worked for me. That's very different from like a one-on-one coaching session or direct feedback where someone tells you something based on an actual knowledge of your game. And I always prefer to weight that information just a little bit heavier because it's based on a knowledge of who I am and where my deficiencies are. But it's also worth noting that even in that context, the instructor could be wrong. The person could have an idea of what would work for you. And if they're knowledgeable, you probably want to weight that idea a little bit, but it doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to be correct. Because again, nobody is a better you than you. And only you will really be able to determine what works and what doesn't work for you. I agree that, of course, when you're at a white belt level, when you're a day one white belt or even a few stripes, you show up at the gym, you don't have the background knowledge to really be making big, wild decisions at that point. But once you start to get a bit of experience, it does become important to understand that not all advice and guidance is equal. And just because something worked for one person, that doesn't guarantee it's going to work for you as well.
For sure, man. Yeah. Yeah. It's like you've got to ultimately, if you want, I think, to really understand what's going on, you've got to like walk down the path yourself. And any advice other people are giving you, including, but not limited to, like, myself and yourself, you know what I mean? Like Steve and I, yeah. Right? Like the person listening to this podcast, right? Like we're just talking about our views. We're giving our perspectives, things that have worked for us and will hopefully work for you. But you're going to have to, like, ultimately, you're the one who's going to have to get the job done for yourself, right? And what that means, getting the job done for you, might not be the same thing for me, might not be the same thing for Steve, right? Like, we're all going to have different things that, what that means, and we've got to figure that out for ourselves. And yeah, I mean, it's like, man, there's so much that goes into it because, like, so what's interesting, I think, about jiu-jitsu, like learning jiu-jitsu, is I think that I don't think jiu-jitsu is especially complicated when compared to other areas of learning. But what I think makes it complicated is the like extremely high number of potential variables that that are very difficult to account for from the perspective of an instructor, right? Like things like height, length of limbs, stability of limbs, personality, your like, I don't know, there's so many things, man. Like here's a really small one. I was rolling recently at an open mat and the mats were like really slippery and the mat didn't have a lot of grip on it. And I just sort of like noticed that this affected my passing. I was like, okay, I have to pass differently here. I can't like plant my feet as hard as I would on like the mats at B team, which have like a lot of grip. So it's like, okay, that's going to matter, right? And these small variables, they change so much, And so these small variables interact in so like an infinite number of possible ways. And then that affects like ultimately like air quote, what works. That's why like I've kind of been like dogging on this phrase, like what works, because I think like it is like, it assumes that there's a single given like set of things that work when in reality, there are so many variables that you are like juggling. There's no fucking possible way someone could say, oh, this is what works and everything that's not this doesn't and sucks.
Yeah. It's something that, you brought up the variability of jiu-jitsu, which is one of the other things about the sport that I think makes it hard to pin down the right answer. There are some disciplines in life where things are relatively constant and consistent, but there are others where there's just so much variability that it's hard to really draw conclusions. Common metaphor that people like to make is they'll say things like jiu-jitsu is like chess, but really, it's not when you think about it. I mean, in chess, look, if I take my pawn and I move my pawn 2 steps forward, if Gary Kasparov moves his pawn 2 steps forward, it's the exact same thing as if I do it. Whereas in jiu-jitsu, all movements and techniques are not created equal. I mean, if I do an armbar, it's not going to resemble the way that you do an armbar at all. It could be wildly different. So to say things like arm bars are high percentage is in itself a little bit misleading, because no two people do the armbar the exact same way. It's not like in chess where, look, moving the pawn 2 steps forward is going to be the same no matter who does it. The context matters, the style matters, the situation matters. So every armbar is a unique and beautiful snowflake in a lot of ways. And that is another reason why it's hard to draw and dangerous to draw broad strokes conclusions about the sport and just copy what other people do.
Yeah, so it's funny. I literally was thinking about this the other day, that it is actually not like chess at all. First of all, the assumption that in jiu-jitsu, both people are actively pursuing the submission is something you can only believe if you've never watched competition at all. Okay. Like, it's not what's happening. Okay. But usually, like, both people are not actively trying to submit one another or even trying to progressively advance on one another positionally. Okay. Like, oftentimes, like, one person just is stalling and not doing anything, or both people are. That happens a lot too. Like, have you ever watched the heavyweight match? Like, that happens all the time.
Oh, yeah. Heavyweight matches are fun because there's like a glorious 30 seconds of barn burner explosive activity, and then everyone just takes a nap.
Yeah, there's a lot of collar ties in heavyweight matches. But anyway, so like, and like, yeah, you're right. Like, also, like, so think about it. Like, when you talk about, like, okay, the armbar as being like moving a piece in chess, it's like this idea that like you input armbar into a computer and then you always get the same result back. When in reality, like, there's so many fucking variables that are going to change whether it works or not. I think if we want to keep things as simple as possible, what's a good idea is to, like, I think broadly speaking, the main thing you should just try to do without getting too complex into it is think about what your goals are, establish your goals, whether they're competition or otherwise. Look at other people that have succeeded in accomplishing those goals and sort of just move out from there. And I kind of want to touch on this goals thing again, because like your goals could be like really simple stuff. Like it might just be something like, I want to get out of mount. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't even have to be, I want to win ADCC. It could be like, fuck, man, this like big purple belt keeps mounting me and I want that to not happen anymore, right? Like, like, so that could be a goal for you early on. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, you can think of goals in terms of like really long-term projects. And that's, I think, probably the best way to do it ultimately. But like, and then that long-term project is broken down into smaller projects. But then like, if you don't have like that at first, you can just start off with things like, man, there's this blue belt with a really good triangle and he keeps catching me in it. How do I not get tapped to the triangle? Right? Have you ever heard that story? Everybody's heard this fucking story of like Michael Jordan, and he was like, he lost a game and then he went to the court and he took a shot like 200 times that he missed in the game, right? A specific like angle or something. And I really like that story because it's like, that's, I think, an example of having a short-term goal. It's being like, okay, this didn't work in this specific context. Let's figure this out in this specific context, right? So you have a very specific, narrow problem. You reverse engineer and you troubleshoot it. And then you try to figure out what'll work. And there's always this dynamic interaction between you, the problem solver, and the problem, right? Like maybe that blue belt who keeps triangling you, you start defending really well against his. Oh, then, oh no, you go to an open mat in another school and this other guy has, I don't know, like more jacked hamstrings, and it changes how you're going to possibly defend the triangle, right? Like, and then you're going to have to think about that. And anyway, getting into the woods with this, the point that I'm getting at is that like, so you got your goals, and then you want to think about like, look at people who've already solved those goals, and then you reverse engineer how they did what they did. And then you just keep doing that forever. And then that's jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. And I think you brought up a really great point, too, about the importance of micro goals. Yes, you do. It is important to have a North Star goal, like an idea of where you want to get to, because without that, I mean, what are you doing, really? But you also need to tie that to individual incremental goals on a day-by-day basis. And one of the main differences I see between people who really dramatically improve at jiu-jitsu versus people who don't is the people who are measurably getting better are the people who do come in with those micro goals. They have a goal for every class. They've got a very specific thing they want to work on, usually based on a problem that they had in the last class. And so they come in with a plan about how to work on it. And that's a much more deliberate approach approach than the more, I guess, classic approach of just kind of letting professor just show whatever he wants. And if today we're doing 3 side control escapes, then that's what we're all working on, regardless of whether that's a problem people have. So I think that having that aspect of deliberate practice and having a purpose for why you train, setting those smaller specific goals is quite critical to long-term growth.
Yeah. So this brings up actually another topic, which I think is really interesting, which is like the practical implementation of what we've been describing. So like your average student, I can 100% picture what I would be thinking if I listened to this podcast. I'd be like, okay, that's great what you guys are saying. But when I show up to class, my instructor just makes me do this stuff. And I never get the time to just, like, let's say you watch a really long instructional and then you show up to training and you never get the chance to drill any of that stuff, right? So I think like the ways to solve that are like, there's 2 like really practical, easy things you can do early on to try to like solve that. The first is if there's free time, if you have it, you may not have it, but if you have free time, grab a like-minded training partner. Hopefully you can find one and just drill, right? That's very uncomplicated. But let's assume that you can't find that. You can't find a training partner who wants to drill, and maybe your coach isn't letting you use the mat during that time, whatever. So then what you should do is just start drilling whatever you want and don't listen to your coach. No, just kidding. Don't do that. Okay. So I'm kidding.
Okay. There's a quote I am definitely taking out of context. I'm just kidding. I'll leave. I won't. But yeah, no, I know exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. No. So what I would actually recommend doing is, and I think I personally believe this is the single best way to get better at jiu-jitsu. When you roll, don't just roll and just roll. Like, assuming you have rolls at the end of class, right? I mean, that's probably a fair assumption in your average jiu-jitsu class, right? Go into your rolls, think of them as almost like drilling sessions. And you can even do this if you're way shittier than the other person. Let's say you're a white belt and you're rolling with a brown belt and you're like, fuck, this guy's going to fuck me up. Well, you're probably not going to be able to consistently if you go into that roll with the goal of, okay, I'm going to work my back finishes, I'm going to keep choking him from the back. Well, that's going to probably be hard. So like, maybe that's not the guy to roll with in that round for that. Maybe you want to grab another white belt. But in the roll with the brown belt, okay, you can't get behind him. Maybe think about, what can I work on that is realistic in this role? So for instance, like maybe he keeps passing your guard and pinning you in side control. Well, okay, you should work on your side control escapes. You can look at that guy and go, okay, this is the guy to work my side control escapes, right? And like, I do this in my training. Like whenever I roll with a new person, I'll kind of like think to myself, okay, what is this person like useful for practicing, right? Maybe this guy's got really aggressive Toriando passing. Okay, great. I'm going to practice my guard retention against that style of attack. Maybe this guy, like I have one training partner at B team. He's like this short wrestler who's fucking super good at deep half and really like he's so hard to knee cut on, and like it's pretty hard to score when he turtles, like hard to get your hooks in on, and like he plays in like a very 80cc rules kind of way, like very clearly that's what he's going for, and he's got like a really good skill set for that rule set. That guy is really good for those rounds. But if I wanted to work, let's say I wanted to work leg lock defense, that guy's not the right round because he's not going to attack me with that, right? I'm going to want to grab someone else. I go, like I have another training partner who's like a taller German guy who fucking is obsessed with leg locks. So I know if I grab him, he's almost definitely going to attack me with leg locks. So I'm going to get the chance to work on leg lock defense. So you have to kind of tailor what you want to work on with what you can work on, right? Like, and this can be difficult. Like you could be in a school, you might think to yourself, all right, based on my goals, the most important thing for me to work on right now is maybe attacking a turtle when someone is building up to their base. Like that's an important skill set in 80cc. But everyone at my school rolls the guard. Well, yeah, it's going to be tough then to work on that. Maybe you want to talk to people and say, hey man, like let's work on this. Let's work on building up to our base instead of just turtling, and maybe you're going to have to convince people, or maybe switching schools, you know what I mean? Maybe that's not the right school for what you're trying to accomplish. That's something you'd have to think about. But anyway, the broad thing that I'm saying here is use your roles and use rolling partners accordingly to work on specific skills you want for specific goals.
Yeah, and that's also an important mindset shift that makes jiu-jitsu, frankly, a lot more enjoyable for a lot of people. I mean, I know that there are a lot of grapplers out there, usually, especially at the junior level, who get really frustrated and demoralized when they're in there rolling with someone who's just 100 pounds bigger than them and just mashes them in side control. And if you go into that role with the objective that I want to tap this person and that's my goal, then yeah, you're likely going to be demoralized coming out of that. But that's a major learning opportunity. I mean, it is a very important skill to be able to consistently escape from bad positions against a bigger, stronger opponent. So that should really be a good micro goal that you could focus on for that training session. And rather than dreading rolling with that big giant person because you're going to get stuck in side control, you can look at that as an opportunity to actually solve your greatest problem. And that is, to me, that was one of the biggest breakthroughs I had when it came to fighting more effectively against larger people, is just reframing in my mind how I use those people as training partners rather than dreading those roles, looking forward to those moments because they were opportunities to practice my greatest weakness.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing to look at training and maybe even all of jiu-jitsu as ultimately being an exploration of what's possible in terms of skill. Like, I think when you frame it this way, it's, obviously also we want to win competitions too, right? So like, if you go out, you compete, you lose, and you're upset over the result, I do not judge you for that. That's pretty natural. But I think in the grand scheme of things, it's probably better overall to focus on, like thinking of what you're doing as being an exploration of the limits of what's possible with skill, right? And when you go into a session with that mindset, like, it's also just like way more fun, I think. Like, imagine somebody who figures out early on, they get really, really good at a few things, and then they never deviate from that. Like, we all know people like this. And it's like, you might even be really competitively successful like that. But I don't know, man, that sounds super fucking boring to me. Like, even if I was winning a ton of tournaments like that, like, I would probably keep doing it because I want to keep winning. But at the same time, it's like, geez, I'd also want personally to like branch out just because I think I would get bored,
Yeah. That is one of my favorite things about jiu-jitsu, which is that it is an actively developing arms race. Things that worked even a year or two ago can wind up being dramatically different from what's working now. So it's a very hard sport to get too stuck in your ways in because the game is always evolving, which is an interesting callback to what you were talking about regarding high percentage techniques. I mean, a lot of the techniques that we use now that we consider high percentage barely even existed a decade ago, which should probably be an important thing that we think about when we frame in our mind what high percentage means. There can be things that come out of nowhere that are now high percentage, but in the past they weren't. So that definition is not constant. It can evolve over time.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what's interesting about that is I think most things have always kind of existed somewhere. Like, there are most techniques, you can find examples of people doing it in the past. It's just the degree to which we emphasize those techniques as a community, right? So like, I could show you videos of Hoyler Gracie doing heel hooks in like 1998. And so, like, now again, of course, they're not as sophisticated as like what people are doing nowadays. Not even close. But the fact is, they were still there, right? So it's like, it's not new per se. It's the degree to which we emphasize it, right? He was using them back then and having success with them, but they're not comparable to what we do now because we around like 2016 to 2019, that was like, leg locks were like probably the single biggest focus of the jiu-jitsu community. I think everyone and their mother wanted to be like the next big leg locker. And I think recently the new thing has become wrestling, right? And there's always going to be like a new hot thing.
I do love the idea that jiu-jitsu has finally discovered wrestling, like this sport that's been around since time immemorial. We're like, you know what? Those wrestlers might actually be onto something. It's like a 5,000 or 6,000 year old sport, for fuck's sake. We just discovered it in jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, it definitely is funny in a way. Like, yeah, like I kind of like whenever people say the new meta is wrestling, I'm just like, I don't know, like, is that new? Like, I don't know, but it does feel like people, it does feel like kind of like with leg locks. Now it's something that people are emphasizing like way more. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a funny example, too, of how what's high percentage can change over time. Because, I mean, I've heard a lot of instructors straight up say, like, don't even do stand up. Just get to your butt as soon as possible. And under certain rule sets, that's sometimes reasonable advice, right? You're not overly incentivized under IBJJF rules to go for takedowns. Not to say you shouldn't or you shouldn't practice that, but the rule set doesn't emphasize or reward that any more dramatically than they do just pulling guard. So it's an interesting example of how these strategies can be very dictated by the rules that we have in place as well.
Yeah. So for instance, like this calls back to the very beginning of the conversation, which is like, so like, if you told me your number one goal was to win EBI someday, and then I saw you working your wrestling a lot, I would just tell you that you're wasting your time. If that's your main goal, you know what I mean? And it's not because wrestling, air quote, doesn't work. It's because that's not the most important thing in that rule set. Like if your goal is winning EBI, I think the main thing you should work on if you want to win EBI, you want to be very efficient with your movements. You want to not get tired. You want to get really good at submission defense, just generally speaking. You want to get really good at leg locks. And then most importantly, you want to get really good at finishing from and maintaining back control and escaping back control. And then the same thing from the armbar position, finishing from and maintaining the armbar position and escaping the armbar position. That's the most important skill in EBI because ultimately elite EBI rules matches, generally speaking, come down to overtime. So like in that rule set, that should be a priority. Those are the things you should be focusing on. Day in and day out, you should try to become the absolute best in the world at those things. And anything else you get good at is like a cherry on top, right? Oh, cool. You've got really good leg lock offense. That's awesome. But not as important as back control and arm bar. You know what I mean? Those are the most important things. Or even leg lock defense for that matter, right? Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something that I have kind of come to the conclusion as well, which is that a big part of the EBI game is just staying safe and in a lot of cases, just trying to stall out to overtime and to try to take it there in the shutout at the end, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think that was a pretty comprehensive discussion, Robert. Is there anything else, any closing thoughts you wanted to share that we didn't already get into here?
The main takeaway I hope people draw from this is that like, ultimately, I'm just trying to like make it easier for people, like more efficient for people when they first get into the sport to like sort of evaluate how they can get what they want out of the sport. Because I think interestingly, like somebody could also listen to this podcast and their stated goal in jiu-jitsu could just be having fun. And then to that end, you may just want to just disregard every single thing I've said in this entire podcast, right? Like maybe you're like, oh, he's thinking about it too much and I just want to go and have fun. That's fine. That would actually be in line with what I'm saying. I'm just, for those guys that do have specific things, right? Maybe they do really crave getting better, faster. Maybe they really crave developing very specific skills for specific goals. I'm trying to like frame how to best do that. And hopefully I've done that.
Yeah, I thought you did an amazing job, man. Well, I know that if people want to dig deeper into your work, you've got a ton of quality instructionals to share. If people want to follow you or check out that stuff, how do they do it?
Best way to do it is through my Instagram or probably just go to my Instagram because then in my Instagram, I have a link in the bio where you can go to my website or my YouTube channel. So it's Robert Degle. So Robert Degle BJJ, just like one word. And then that'll take you to my Instagram. And then the link is at the bottom of the bio.
Amazing. Yeah. And as always, I'll put that link in the show notes. So if anyone wants a quick click through, just go there and you should be able to get to Robert's stuff pretty quick. And of course, on our side, I think most people probably know, but we've got a premium service that I'm quite proud of. BJJ Mental Models Premium. There's a ton of in-depth coursework in there and really interesting conversations, long-form stuff that we've had with some of the guests that we've had on the show. I mentioned earlier that we did a big game planning series specifically about how to define your game plan. So I do encourage everyone to check that out if they haven't. There's a free trial, so you can do it and grab that stuff at no cost. Again, really appreciated because it floats the show. You can do that at premium.bjjmentalmodels.com. One more time, that's premium.bjjmentalmodels.com. And I always have that link in the show notes as well. Robert, thanks a lot, man. Great chat. Really appreciated this. I think we were able to do some good myth busting for a lot of people to help them think more critically about how they put together their training plan and goal set.
Yeah, hopefully. Thank you. I appreciate always coming on.
Great to have you too, man. Always love having you on. And of course, to everyone who hangs out with us here every week listening, thanks again to you as well. And we'll see you next week.